Welcome to episode 348 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Elizabeth Mireles, who served in the FBI for 24 years, and retired agent Edmundo Mireles Jr., who served in the FBI for 25 years. In this episode, Liz and Ed review the 1983 kidnapping conspiracy case where the wife of a retired former Colombian ambassador to the United States was abducted at gunpoint from the driveway of her home near Miami. The investigation took place in Miami, Alexandria, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. Liz and Ed were among the hundreds of FBI agents working 24/7 to find the kidnapping victim before her abductors made good on their threat to kill her. In their recently published true crime book, Hostage: 7 Days in Captivity, Liz and Ed provide an insider's look at the major kidnapping investigation. Their book can be purchased at edmireles.com. After graduating from the FBI Academy, Liz was initially assigned to the Atlanta Division in Georgia, where she worked on a variety of cases, including the Wayne Williams missing and murdered children investigation. A year later, she was transferred to the Miami field office, where she was assigned to a Foreign Counterintelligence Squad, FCI, specializing in Cuban matters. She became one of 2 long-term undercover agents in an FCI investigation that involved several other federal agencies. The other UCA was a new agent named Ed Mireles, who was assigned to the Washington field office. After this assignment, Liz became the team leader for the Miami Division's newly established Evidence Response Team, ERT, and she and Ed started dating. Once they got married, he was transferred to Miami. After Ed was injured in the Miami shootout, Liz and Ed were transferred to the FBI Academy at Quantico, Virginia, while Ed underwent several reconstructive surgeries. Later in her career, Liz was assigned back to Miami and then to the Omaha office and the Phoenix Division's Tucson resident agency, where she was the ERT team leader, before returning to Virginia, where Ed worked as an instructor at the FBI Academy and she worked out of an undercover location. After retiring from the FBI, Liz worked on a government contract with the Defense Investigative Agency for 17 years. During Ed Mireles' career, he gained experience as a street agent, supervisor, and manager in a wide range of investigative and administrative areas, as well as extensive work as the primary undercover agent in high-risk criminal and national security investigations. Ed was involved in 2 deadly force confrontations with armed adversaries and has been wounded twice. The Miami shootout on April 11, 1986, resulted in the death of 2 criminals and the death of 2 FBI agents and the critical wounding of 5 other agents. Ed reviewed this case in episodes 118 and 119 of FBI Retired Case File Review. He received numerous awards citing his bravery, to include the National Police Officer of the Year Award from the International Associations of Chief of Police, the Federal Law Enforcement Officer of the Year, and the Attorney General's Award for Exceptional Heroism from the Department of Justice. The FBI awarded him the first FBI Medal of Valor, and the Texas Department of Criminal Justice honored Ed by dedicating their academy in his name. The Edmundo Mireles Criminal Justice Training Center is in Beeville, Texas. After retiring from the Bureau, Ed, a former Marine, worked as a defense contractor in Iraq as a law enforcement professional and advisor to the Iraqi police, including 1 year embedded in uniform with the Marines. He also worked with the U.S. Department of State in helping to train police in Mexico and Belize. I want to welcome new listeners. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find a link to join my reader team where I talk about crime fiction, and you can learn about the FBI and books, TV, and movies. There are also links to where you can buy me a cup of coffee and discover my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books, available as ebooks and paperbacks wherever books are sold, and audiobooks on Audible and Spotify. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, retired agent Ed Mireles, and his lovely wife, retired agent Elizabeth Mireles. Hey, Ed. Hey, Liz. How are you?
Hey, good morning.
Hey, Jerry. How you doing?
I saw on LinkedIn that you had a new book out, Hostage, 7 Days in Captivity. I immediately sent you an email saying, come on the show, because I really want to help you launch this book and get the word out. Thank you for agreeing to come on and review this case.
No, Jerry, the thanks go to you. You're a godsend because I'm a terrible PR person.
Yeah, the fact that you didn't contact me indicates that maybe that might be true.
Absolutely.
Because you were on the show before. We did a 2-part episode on the Miami shootout. I really appreciate you coming on and doing that episode. I've heard from so many people, listeners, people in law enforcement, and of course, FBI agents who tell me how important and all the lessons that they learn from listening to you go through that case. So I really want to thank you. And I want to thank Liz too, because the part that you played also provides many teachable moments about how these things affect everyone, not just the agents, but also the family.
Yeah, no, Jerry,
Yeah.
you have no idea. The first book is FBI Miami Firefight, 5 minutes to change the bureau. Well, that was just 5 minutes. The other 2 years was Liz behind the scenes, putting up with my crying and whining and stuff. She carried a huge burden on her shoulders for years. And on top of that, she found out she was pregnant when I was in the hospital. So a lot of credit goes to her for putting up with me.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book. I have my copy. Even though this episode, we're talking about your newest book, Hostage, definitely everyone needs to also check out Firefight. What was it called again?
Firefight, 5 minutes that changed the bureau.
We definitely want people to check that out also. This particular case is fascinating. It gives an idea of the magnitude and the importance of this case because you talk about the hundreds of agents, both in Miami and in the DC area, WFO headquarters, who worked on this case. Now, people may not recognize the case as we talk about it because you decided to change the names. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, as I'm sure you know, the FBI pre-publication review unit, they're always very much aware of privacy issues for victims and agents. So in the spirit of privacy for everybody, I decided to change the names of the victims, the suspects, and the agents involved. There are rules and procedures, and it would have made the publication of the book doubly long process. It was simpler just to change the names, except for my wife, Liz, and myself. All the names have been changed.
All right, but this case was definitely in the public domain. And so what I've decided to do, we're going to use the fictitious names that you have chosen to use in your book for the podcast episode. But in the show notes for the episode, which will be on my website, jerrywilliams.com, we will have the actual news articles and all the write-ups with the actual names of all of the players, victim subjects involved. Where do we want to start?
How about if we start from the fact that Ed and I had just met about 18 months, 2 years before. He was in the Washington field office and I was new to the Miami division. We ended up working an undercover case together that lasted 18 months. It involved a number of agencies which had never been done before. We went ahead and worked that case. He went back to DC and I was in Miami. After that, we started dating. Imagine that we finally got together and got along. The first time I met him was when myself and supervisor and the case agent flew up to Washington, D.C. to meet with Ed and various other federal agencies. I remember at first, and we've laughed about this many times, I first met Ed and he had this brown suit coat on and wingtip shoes. And I was like, oh, Lordies.
Not a good first impression?
Yeah, not the best. I mean, I thought, yeah, because he was demanding a lot of things, which were practical demands based on what we were doing. I think everybody was flying by the seat of their pants on this case, and we can't really go into it because it was a foreign counterintelligence type situation. But anyways, we did do that, and eventually during the case and stuff, we got to get along. We had the poor case agent was over a barrel because he was like, guys, let's kind of come together here, because Ed would say something about the case, what we should do. And I was like, I don't think that's a good way to go. And like this, it was constant bickering back and forth until we finally seemed to come up to the same plane and made life easier for the case agent. That's how we originally met.
So you were both playing undercover roles in this case?
Yes, yes.
Were you playing undercover roles where you were supposed to be a couple?
No, we were co-workers, so to speak, in an undercover office. What happened was after the case was called and we went our ways, I was back in the Miami division and he was in Washington field office. And this case happened. We got the call in Miami. It was not unusual to have a kidnapping that involved all Latin American individuals, Spanish speakers, etc. So we got called into the case. Ed is assigned at this time up in the Washington field office. I was assigned to the Foreign Counterintelligence Cuban Matters squad in Miami. And all of us were Spanish speakers on that squad, so we automatically got drafted. When the call came in on Friday night, the duty agent got a call from the spouse. He's the one that reported the situation. He had gotten, I guess, a ransom demand or something from somebody. That's where it all started. That's when we went on 12-hour shifts. Cristina Castillo was the wife of an ambassador. She was taken from her house Friday afternoon when she drove up to the house. These individuals were waiting for her and took her from there. She was a real nice, very distinguished lady. She was a realtor, had a really good business going. She had made a number of contacts when they were originally in D.C. area. When it was their time to go back home to Colombia, they requested and received political asylum. The reason they requested that was because her family and his family were both rather wealthy families, and they had been subjects of various kidnappings in the past in Colombia, which they fortunately had gotten their relatives back safe and sound, but that was at a very heavy financial cost. And I believe one of the subjects had a run-in with the former ambassador, Ricardo, when he proposed a business deal. Ricardo did not like the proposal because it felt like he was going to be taking all the risk versus this other guy just being a participant. And he rejected that. And I think Ed could explain a little bit more about the deal that the guy was proposing.
I was the WFO case agent, so I have a lot of information, more information than Liz had. Ricardo was the Colombian ambassador to the United States between 1977 and 1980. He and his wife, Christina, ran in diplomatic circles in Washington. That's how he got to know a lot of the Washington elite and other diplomats. And he also liaised with a lot of federal agencies in Washington, D.C., where he got to know some FBI agents, presumably from FBI headquarters. As Liz mentioned before, their families had been subjects of kidnappings previously in Colombia. They knew that the environment in the 80s in Colombia was very dangerous. You had a lot of guerrillas, drug dealers, people kidnapping other people for sport. They decided that it was probably safer to stay in the United States than to go back to Colombia. They were granted political asylum. They moved to a logical place. I mean, if you're from Colombia or Latin America, Miami is the place to be. It's a great place to live. So they retired in 1980. And supposedly, they're supposed to live happily ever after until 1983, when Christina was kidnapped from her driveway in broad daylight, about 4:30, 5 o'clock p.m. on a Friday. That starts the beginning of a nightmare for her and for her husband, Ricardo, and of course, the rest of her family. It took time to unravel the plan. The Spanish speakers in Miami are the ones that really carried the load because nobody knew anything. All we knew was that Ricardo had received a ransom call at about 5:30 on Friday. It was kind of a strange call. I said, hey, listen, we have your wife. If you want to see your wife alive, you need to pay us $1.5 million. You should consider that a war tax. And he said, war tax? What are you talking about? He said, never mind. It's for the people. Typical guerrilla insurgent talk. All of that was a red herring. They were trying to mislead Ricardo, making him think that they were affiliated somehow with some Colombian guerrillas or something like that. The kidnapper, who identified himself as Comandante Jose, told Ricardo, hey, listen, go to this park and you'll find your wife's car there. So he said, no, come on, this is no joke. Before he hung up, he said, hey, I'll call you again tomorrow.
I do want to add that this is in the early 1980s. It's not like he could check and call her on her cell phone to see where she is.
No, cell phones weren't even a dream, I don't think, back in 1980. So he runs to the park, finds a car, and then he runs back home, calls his brother. They're trying to figure out what to do. The brother says, hey, let's negotiate with these guys directly and alone. And Ricardo, who was a diplomat in Washington, said, no, we need to call the FBI. Because from his exposure in D.C. with federal agencies, he knew the FBI handled kidnapping cases. He called the FBI Miami, and that's when the FBI Miami jumped to the task. And that's where Liz and the other Spanish-speaking agents were called in to help. At the time, they had nothing. I mean, just one phone call in the middle of the afternoon and an abandoned car. So they set up a command post in the house. They started trying to do grid searches around the recovered car, and they just had to wait.
And let me ask Liz, were you part of those initial interview sessions with Ricardo?
Myself directly, not that I remember. I think we were just called into the office and started getting a brief on what had come in and what was transpiring. Then we ended up going out to his house very carefully.
Talk about that, because I understand why you did it carefully, but people listening may not understand what you're talking about.
Right. By carefully, I mean like an odd hour, like at 4:00 in the morning, obviously being aware of the neighborhood, see if there's any suspicious activity in the neighborhood that somebody could be watching to see if they called in the police or anything like that. When we felt comfortable, we did go into the house and started talking to them about what the calls were and stuff. And that's when we decided, hey, let's get this wire going, an emergency wiretap.
And so you're tapping his phone at his house, his landline.
That's correct. That's when a lot of the Spanish speakers disappeared. Disappeared, I mean, by going to the wiretaps and overhears, and then some at the office, and I ended up in that motorhome.
So explain the motorhome where they set up all the equipment. Was it located near his house?
Not too close to his house. We were in an apartment complex. And I couldn't tell you exactly where it was now,
It's in
but
Southwest.
it was in Southwest Miami that they put us in this apartment complex. From that wiretap in the motorhome is where everything started to develop, and the various individuals started to make the contacts. And the Bureau hooked up the motorhome to some wires and stuff, the power lines in that complex. As a result of that, this other agent and myself were sitting there doing the wire, and I hear this knock on the door. So I go up to the door, and this little old man with his little dog came up, and he was like, you can't be doing that. You're hooked up to our electrical and our power in this complex. I'm going to report you to the police. And I was like, sir, please feel free to do so. And he looked at me kind of awkwardly and huffed off. And then not 10 minutes later, of course, there's a police officer at the door, and I invited him into the motorhome, and he immediately thought, oh, I said, yeah, I identified myself and told him a little bit, not much about the case. He realized, hey, this is a federal thing and this is kosher, no problems. Being on that wire in the motorhome, this other agent and myself realized, hey, there's something going on here, and I think they're transporting her somewhere else. both the other agent and myself were Puerto Rican, but we realized by the accents and stuff that we were hearing and the language that was being used that it was probably Colombians. And so we decided that we were looking for the Colombians and at least that aspect of it, which kind of helped the investigators that were trying to do all the interviews with the spouse of the victim. We ended up hearing some verbiage and stuff that were going like, hey, they are transporting. Sounds like they're heading north. Bureau found the vehicle that she had been taken away in, which was her vehicle. The individuals told the spouse, the husband, Ricardo, that her vehicle was parked in a certain area in a park and her stuff was in it and all. And it was verified. We found the vehicle and then we towed the vehicle to the Miami FBI office where it was duly processed for any evidence. As the time transpired and listening to the whole thing, we decided that, hey, she's being taken out of town based on what they're saying. And one thing and the other, it came out that we decided she was going to be up in Washington area because of all the surveillances and stuff that started taking place. I called Ed from the motorhome actually telling him, hey, we believe, and that's just between you and us here, us two agents, that she's probably going to be headed towards Washington area. And he's like, I haven't heard anything. And I said, well, I'm calling you because at this point in time, I know you're part of the Joint Terrorism Task Force. You're one of the only Spanish speakers up there. And we're all working it down here as Spanish speakers. So I'll bet that you're going to be the one who's going to get the case. And they made a connection. And I'll let Ed talk about that connection that ended up tying the Alexandria office into the case. The main guy, Alonso Herrera, he was the mastermind of the kidnapping. He's the one who started with all the initial telephone calls.
Alonso was developed as a potential suspect from the interviews conducted of Ricardo. As Liz alluded to before, he had met Ricardo about a year before, 10 months, 12 months before, and made a business proposal to him, which Ricardo said, no way, Jose. That's a risky venture. He told Alonso, he said, hey, I'll be taking all the risk and you'll be reaping all the benefits. So he rejected the proposal. Okay, we didn't know it at the time of the kidnapping, but Alonso took it pretty badly because he started plotting a kidnapping plot against Ricardo and his family, unbeknownst to anybody. That was the first potential suspect we had. The FBI in Miami had to locate his residence and stuff. It started from there. But let me give you some historical background as to how the FBI, in Miami at least, how they worked kidnapping cases. You mentioned before that there were no cell phones at the time. I didn't even have a pager at that time.
Wow.
I wasn't worthy. So what they used to do, Jerry, and I don't know how they did it in other field offices, but what Miami used to do is, well, let me take another step back. 90% of the kidnappings in Miami involved Spanish-speaking people, okay? At the time, 80% of the population in Miami was Hispanic. So that's your clientele. And almost 100% of the kidnappings in Miami at the time were Hispanic on Hispanic violations. That's why all the Spanish-speaking agents were called in right away. So what they had at the time, most of the kidnapping cases, we usually had nothing. We had a victim and a victim's address or a business address. I don't know whether it's unique to Miami or not, but the FBI Miami started a system. They would flood the zone with agents. They would literally assign an agent to sit in a car 24/7. They would rotate shifts. But let's say you, me, and Liz are part of the team. Liz could be at the Home Depot, and you would be at the Costco, and I would be at the McDonald's spread out in Southwest Miami, and we would be waiting. And if the consensual monitoring wiretap, the Title III, received a phone call and revealed an address, the idea was that we would have an agent within a half a mile or a mile, potentially, of where the call came from, usually from a payphone. So what Miami would do would be flood the zone, and if they identified a public phone booth, they would send agents, they would vector agents into that area to see if they could identify a caller on the phone. And that's what had happened in this case. There's no GPS, there's nothing. It's just gumshoe, cars, and waiting.
That's when we used to look up phone numbers on our big books that we used to have in the office. We'd have somebody with the books, and the phone number would come in and register on the wire, and we'd call it in right away to the office, and they'd look it up and say, hey, that's a public phone booth at this location. And that's how it worked at a snail's pace, so to speak.
So anyway, getting back, Alonso was the person identified as the only possible point of conflict between Ricardo and anybody he knew.
Why would you say that when he had indicated that he wanted to stay in the United States?
Ricardo had the meeting with Alonso, the mastermind. He would end up being the mastermind. He had that business venture proposal that Ricardo rejected.
I think that we came up on Alonso because he was thoroughly interviewed. Ricardo was thoroughly interviewed, and in speaking to him, his friends, business partners, etc., everybody absolutely loved him, and they also really liked his wife. And there was no reason for anybody to be trying to do anything that would harm this family, with the exception of this guy, which is one that Ricardo later recalled as, hey, this guy came up with this proposition. And I said, no. That's where it really started to snowball.
That makes sense. So you're looking for potential.
The office zeroed in on Alonso, but as I mentioned in my book, what do kidnapping masterminds do on a sunny day? Nothing. They just hang out. The time that this was going on, this is like the first day, second day, 18, 24, 36 hours into the case, more demand calls started coming in. When the FBI surveillance teams were zeroed in on Alonso, he was at home or he was at a shopping center having coffee, a ransom demand call came into the residence. And we said, uh-oh, what's going on here? So we knew we had at least two suspects.
Or the wrong subject.
Or the wrong, that's true, the wrong suspect. The ransom calls were coming into the residence, okay? And that's when, if you recall, I described an elaborate system of flooding the zone in Miami. That's when the FBI really got to work. The calls were coming in, and they identified a location. It was like a 7-Eleven gas station, but by the time the agents got there, the individual was gone. Nobody saw anything. I'm sure you've worked these types of cases before, Jerry. Back then, it isn't like TV. I mean, you're not doing something exciting every hour on the hour. A lot of times you can go hours and hours and hours with boring waiting, just waiting for something to happen, a ransom call or something.
Let me ask you a question, because a lot of times you ask for proof of life. Was that done?
That was done, exactly. One of the ransom calls, one of the initial ones, Ricardo said, hey, how do I know you have my wife? And he goes, well, we do have your wife. He said, well, I know my wife's missing, but how do I know you have her? So he said, hey, if you do truly have her, he said, hey, ask her a test question. And the caller at the time was confused. He said, what do you mean a test question? The only people that would have an answer is me and her. If she gives you the right answer, then I know you have her. So he said, oh, okay, I understand. So he asked a proof of life question, and he asked, what is our daughter's nickname? Okay, so if you can get me the answer to that next time you call me, then I believe you have my wife. The next phone call that happened after that was like a day later. He said, hey, do you have the answer to my question? And the unknown caller on the phone said, yeah, your daughter's nickname is Calita. And it was correct. He said, okay, that's the right answer. So I know that you do have my wife. Obviously, she's missing, and you got the right answer. They proceeded to talk negotiations about ransom demands and so on and so forth. We got lucky, the Miami FBI office got lucky in that the second or third phone call, I forget which one it was now, they were able to vector into another convenience store. It was called a U-Totem. It's like a 7-Eleven, but it was called U-Totem on US 1 and 42nd Avenue in Southwest Miami. We just happened to have an FBI agent 5 blocks away when the call went in. And as Liz alluded to before, the number comes in, it's registered on the Title III or the pen register. They checked the number, and it was a public phone booth at the U-Totem at that location. They told the nearest agent to that location. He speeds to that location. It was a Sunday evening in the rain, and he said he almost crashed his car 2 or 3 times. He ends up going into the U-Totem, and he looks at the bank of phones in front of the store, and he said there's no one there. But he did see a car leaving the parking lot, just casually driving away, and he noted which direction it went. He noted the color and the make. He looked around. He went in the store, said, hey, was there anybody on the phone booth here recently? He said, dude, I don't know, man. I'm watching the store, not the phones. The agent jumped back in his car, started following in the direction that the suspicious car went, and that was a red Fairmont. He followed it, and he was driving like 80 miles an hour down a residential street because he saw some taillights way down the road. He zipped up there, and sure enough, it was a red Fairmont. And that was our first real big break. He got the license tag on the car. He was trying to do a one-man surveillance, which, Jerry, you and I both know it's impossible to do a one-man surveillance. So he tried not to be too suspicious, and he lost the Fairmont. Jerry, that was a big break in the case because with the tag, obviously, we got the license plate, and then we went through the Florida Department of Motor Vehicles. It ended up being a rental car, and then we got the name of the person who rented the car. That was the development of a second suspect. The second individual that was identified was Ramon Cruz. We found out through deductive reasoning and surveillances and so on and so forth that he was the one making the ransom calls. The other individual, Alonso, he was just hanging out. He was just kind of in the background. The surveillances eventually were able to verify that the mastermind, Alonso, and Ramon, his main assistant, would meet. The surveillance teams followed them, and they met in person in various locations around Miami at an office complex, at a shopping center, at coffee shops, and so on and so forth. That was a huge break in the case. I had no idea what was going on. Liz is working this case in Miami. The only reason I know this, as I mentioned before, is because I was a case agent at WFO. I got all the information after the case was completed. Unbeknownst to anybody, the victim had just totally disappeared, okay? And everybody kept trying to figure out, where is she? I mean, she was gone for 24 hours. And that's where Liz and her partner, Angel, started listening to the wiretap calls. Said, hey, there's something weird going on. We're only getting part of the story. As they got more and more information, they got more and more wiretaps. They started wiretapping Alonso's residence, the mastermind. They started wiretapping his office. And then they found out that there was a secondary apartment location that Alonso had in South Miami. They started wiretapping that.
Why don't we let Liz jump in? Liz, what was Ed talking about when he said that the calls were strange and something else seemed to be going on?
Well, it just seems like they were talking where it sounded like they were transporting her somewhere based on what they were saying. As long as it had been going on, we were thinking, hey, she's being transported out of state.
What was it that made you think that? Because you're listening to these calls.
You know what? I think it was at the time that they got a call, and Ramon Cruz was the one that was identified as a result of the surveillances going out on all the different phone booths in the area where these calls were coming from. And he's the one that was identified. The car was identified leaving the area. That's what ended up making a connection to Ramon, who was connected to Alexandria.
Right. Jerry, what happened was when we got the tag, it was a rental car, and the rental car company said that Ramon had a residence in Alexandria, Virginia. That kind of linked Alexandria to Miami, even though we had no solid proof other than the fact that one of the two kidnappers was a resident of Alexandria.
We're like, they don't have her here. I don't think it sounds like she's been transported. I don't specifically remember the conversation that my partner and I listened to that we're like, hey, you know what? They've transported her to Alexandria. We figured after they had identified Ramon Cruz as the main caller from one of the public phone booths, which the agent had followed his car from and gotten a tag, and then we identified the individual as having rented a car. And his home address was reflected as being in Alexandria. And then based on the different conversations that were going on, we're thinking, hey, he's got her or somebody's got her up in Alexandria. I don't specifically recall what it was that made us say, hey, it's Alexandria. And that's what precipitated my calling Ed to tell him, hey, I think you guys are to be involved in this case.
Liz, let me ask you, usually in a kidnapping case, there's some demand during this time period before they move her. Were they saying how much money they wanted, where it needed to be? And it's kind of strange that they're taking her someplace else.
At the time, they hadn't made specific demand as to where. They were just more concerned as to how much money he could get. And it being a weekend and stuff, he couldn't get the money. So that precipitated more negotiations as to the amount that he could get and when he could get it and all this kind of stuff. But there was no mention of where he was to deliver the money at the beginning. I think this just kind of developed after they got her up into Alexandria.
At this point, as you believe they're transferring her to Alexandria, you do believe that this guy that we're calling Alonzo, the mastermind, was involved, and you have been able to identify his associate, Ramon, because of the car that had left the convenience store. You really feel at this time that you know who's involved.
That's correct. At this point, then we know that Alonso being the mastermind, and then Ramon comes in as being the caller, making the ransom demands. And then when it was determined that Ramon was from Alexandria, at this point, they still didn't say where she was or where they were supposed to come up with the money and stuff. They were just more concerned about how is he going to come up with the money and how fast can he come up with the money. And it being a weekend, it just put a wrench in their plans because they didn't think about this, whether they knew or didn't know the banking system. They're closed at noon on Saturday. He would not be able to make that withdrawal or attempt to make a withdrawal until Monday. During that time period, I think is when the plan started to develop as to where they were supposed to take the money to in exchange for the spouse, Christina.
Ed was explaining to us that kidnappings in the Miami area were frequent, and I would imagine that many of them did not turn out very well. What was the atmosphere and what was the victim, Ricardo, thinking?
We in Miami FBI had a pretty high level of success for the kidnappings. Obviously, I had worked a couple other kidnappings that were not successful at all and quite stressful to all of us that were involved. We had a pretty high level of success, bordering on, I think, about 90% success. And that is something that Ricardo was made aware of by our SAC and our ASAC that were in conversations with him, trying to assure him that, hey, we're going to take as much manpower as we need to get your wife home safely. They did tell him, hey, obviously, we're not 100% success rate, but we have a very, very high success rate at about 90% in Miami. All of us, the Spanish speakers, we worked not only the kidnappings, we worked hijackings, and it was constant down there, the hijackings and the kidnappings. So we were kind of used to working as a unit, even though some of us did not work on the kidnapping squad or anything else. When we came together, we were the squad to handle it, and it worked wonderfully.
The kidnappers, they had great ambitions, but they really screwed up. They kidnapped a lady on a Friday afternoon. And back in the day, some banks closed Saturday and Sunday, and a lot of the banks that were open closed at noon. So they wanted Ricardo, the victim, to withdraw $1.5 million, which in the 1983 was like saying $10 million now, and have it ready to turn over to them in like a half a day. And he said, hey, listen, guys, there is no way in heaven or hell that I can get that much money on such short notice. And they kept bullying him. Why? Well, it's the weekend, dudes. Banks are closed. There was a long pause on one of the recorded conversations. I don't think the bad guys had realized, oh my God, it's true. Banks are closed on weekends. So the issue about, hey, turn the money over here, we want the money here and there. I found out post-arrest that they had a couple of different plans. A couple of the plans were misleading plans, but the actual plan that they had in mind, which they were never able to execute, was they wanted Ricardo's son or nephew to go to the Miami International Airport and walk around the airport from phone booth to phone booth. Like you see in the movies, you get a phone call out of one phone booth and say, hey, go to the American counter and there's a bank of phones there and wait for a call. And then go to the United counter and wait for a phone call. They were going to move him around. And then eventually they would lead him to a men's room where the exchange would be made. That was their true plan. But we never got to that.
That was not a very good plan.
No, it was an absolute stupid plan. But I guess I'd watched too many movies on So things started to deteriorate from there because they wanted 1.5 mil. And the victim, Ricardo, said, hey, man, I can't get that much money between now and Monday. It takes time. So he kept stalling and stalling and stalling. It went from 1.5 mil to 800,000 to 600,000 to 400,000. And then at the end, they were just saying, hey, get whatever money you can, but you got to have it by this date. Otherwise, it's your wife. It was just a comedy of errors on their part.
All right. So what happens next? You have this feeling. You're not sure, but it appears that she is being transferred. I guess she's being driven from Miami
Right,
to Alexandria
right.
in the car that you've already identified, the rental car.
No, this was in another car.
There were three groups in this gang, okay? One was a mastermind. He was by himself. The second group was the caller. And then the third part of the gang was the actual kidnappers. The kidnappers were a kid by the name of Raul who recruited three young black kids out of D.C. to go from Washington, D.C. to Miami to help kidnap this lady. Once they kidnapped her, they were supposed to go to Fort Lauderdale, but instead, I don't know what happened. They crossed wires or whatever. So they drive her all the way to Washington, D.C., unbeknownst to us. They drove her all the way to Washington, D.C. It took 24 hours in a green station wagon with no air conditioning. So it was probably very terrible. Eventually, during one of the phone calls, again, we had wiretapped the apartment. We discovered Alonso's business, his home, and Ricardo's residence. Okay, so we had everything was wired for stereo. When we identified Alonso, they identified his residence, they wiretapped his residence. When they identified his business, they wiretapped his business. And then we discovered that Alonso had a secondary apartment in South Miami. They wiretapped that. So we had 4 wiretaps going on in Miami at the time.
And one of these wiretaps, that's where it came in that the wiretap started to move north. The call they identified going into Alonso's either residence or business, I don't remember, came up from like Fort Lauderdale, and then it came up from a northern city, I don't recall. And it was these individuals that were transporting her that were calling him for instructions and to say, hey, we're going to do this, or should we go there, or where?
You had these wiretaps on Ramon and Alonso's phone, and you could see calls coming into them that were along the eastern coast. These people were stopping and using payphones.
That was it. And then based on the fact that they had identified Ramon as being from Alexandria, we thought, hey, they're heading north. They're probably going to Alexandria. That's how that came about. That's when I called Ed to tell him, hey, you guys have a possible kidnapping coming up your way. And our office still hadn't put it all together to send to the Washington field office. But we kind of jumped the gun and just said, hey, let's just give them a heads up, because Ed's probably going to get the case anyway, since he's the only Spanish speaker up there.
Let me give you some background on me. At the time, Jerry, in 1983, there were only 5 Spanish-speaking agents assigned to the Washington field office, and we had 400 agents there. So
They kept you busy, I'm sure.
yeah, real busy. So I handled all Central American-related cases. Maybe some of your listeners will recall, back in the 90s, you had the Sandinistas, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and all the civil wars going on back there. The Ollie North fiasco. So anyway, I was pretty busy. Liz knew that I was on the terrorism squad up in Washington, not a kidnapping squad, but a terrorism squad. And the Miami office said, hey, listen, this is possibly the first international terrorism related case in the United States, because the initial phone call said, hey, this is a war tax. If you want your wife back, you need to give us $1.5 million. It made it sound like he was a guerrilla or an insurgent somehow. So Liz calls me and says, hey, dude, you might want to dust off your sleeping bag because you got a case coming your way. So I said, baloney, no way. And sure enough, when she called me like, I think it was Tuesday, July 12th. Sure enough, by the end of the afternoon, we had the case. Let me take a step back. We got the case. It was verified because on Tuesday, July 12th, the wiretap recorded a call between Ramon and an unknown individual in Washington who lived in the northwest part of Washington, D.C., near Meridian Hill Park. He said, hey, I need to get a hold of Raul. Can you tell him to come to the phone? He said, yeah, hold on, let me get him. So he talks to Raul in Spanish, and Raul gives him the phone number to a payphone in front of the Pitts Hotel. That's how we started focusing in on the Pitts Hotel. We didn't have a wiretap on the payphone in DC, but we did have a wiretap on the phone that was being used in Miami. And that's the first time that we established a direct link between one kidnapper and a possible accomplice in Washington, D.C. And he said, hey, how's things going? Everything's fine. Cryptic talk, code talk. How's the package? The package is fine. The boys are getting tired. They want to know when they're going to get paid. To us, Jerry, as investigators, we know what the deal is. They're talking about the package, obviously, or possibly the woman. The boys are getting tired because they've got this hostage that they have to take care of. Liz had called to forewarn me, and then the Miami field office notified headquarters and WFO that the potential connection to the Washington, D.C. area. WFO dusts off his command post, and we start applying for emergency wiretap authority for the payphone. And the rest of it pretty much fell in line. Now, there's a lot of stuff behind the scenes I didn't know until post-arrest. Our book takes all of this post-arrest information and we fill in the blanks up front. Okay, but in the spirit of full disclosure, at the time that this was going on, we had no idea what the heck was going on. Our book is backfilled with the post-arrest investigation, reviewing the wiretaps, interviewing the suspects, interviewing the victim, and so on. That's how we ended up writing a pretty good book, I think. As I said, Liz called me in the afternoons, I don't know, maybe about 1 o'clock. She said, hey, Ed, we've been working on major kidnapping, possible terrorism connection, war tax, $1.5 million. She said, hey, we think they're up in that area, either Alexandria or Washington. The Title III verified that there was a connection to an actual phone booth in Washington, D.C. So we start preparing surveillance teams, command posts. We're trying to figure out what to do with the payphone. Should we try to go in for a regular wiretap or piggyback emergency authority on Miami's emergency authority? So I think I didn't have anything to do with that part of it, but I think they went with the emergency authority piggybacking on the original Miami Title III warrant. By this time, it's like 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and I'm thinking, hey, man, I'm going to go home.
Why would you even think that?
Yeah, really.
I know. I was a naive first office agent. Then I was like, hey, listen, dude, you're the case agent, and we're setting up 12-hour shifts. And I said, okay, well, so what aren't you telling me? Well, your shift starts at 8 p.m. tonight. It's already 5 p.m. And I'm thinking, oh, I've got 3 hours before my shift starts.
And the reality is you probably started right away.
Yep.
Right, exactly. Needless to say, I was in the office till the next day at 10 a.m., 11 a.m. It was a tough evening. All kidding aside, I mean, I'm trying to keep it light, but it was really life and death. This poor lady had been kidnapped. We didn't know where she was. We thought she might be in Alexandria or Washington. We started concentrating on the phone booth. And boy, I'll tell you what, I don't know how well you know Washington, Jerry, but at the time, that area in Washington, it was 14th and Florida Street or something. That was a real bad area. A lot of drug use, drug sellers. I was in Washington in 1971, 70 as a young Marine. Boy, I tell you, 14th Street was like Sodom and Gomorrah.
Ladies of the night.
Yeah, really. It was like, oh my God, I was an 18-year-old kid, fresh out of Texas. And I'm thinking, oh my God, what's going on here? And it hadn't improved much by the 80s. Needless to say, you get a bunch of standard issued FBI agents. The majority of them are white males in a Black Hispanic neighborhood. Man, talk about standing out. Surveillance was really tough around the phone booth. But we did the best we could, and we just kind of hunkered down. We started setting up a perimeter around the payphone in D.C. Miami was still doing its thing, following Alonso and Ramon. Going back and forth. And Ricardo, he's fighting the ransom demand war. They kept calling him periodically, like once or twice a day. Hey, where's the money? Where's the money? He kept trying to stall them. By the way, I forgot. He kept asking for proof of life questions the whole time. It's like, hey, what's our son's nickname? What's your father-in-law's nickname? There's a painting in the den of a duchess. Who is the duchess? In reality, that was a painting of the victim, Christina. It was a big joke in the household. Everybody called her the duchess. And they kept giving the right answers, indicating that they did have her.
And that they were talking to her at the moment. Because in my mind, I keep thinking, well, proof of life, why don't they send a photo? But I keep forgetting this is in the early 1980s. We didn't have that technology.
Yeah, he did originally request a photo of his wife. He says, how do I know you have her? Send me a photo. And the guy said, well, let me think about it. And he came back and said, I can't do it. That's not possible. Because there wasn't the cell phones and stuff where you can just take a picture and send it.
All right. So you're surveilling the area to see who's coming to this phone booth.
Right.
What do you learn?
There's an old saying, I'd rather be lucky than good. WFO got really lucky on Wednesday. We set up a surveillance. We had like 12 agents because it was such a massive area. It was a mixture of row houses and businesses, and some of the houses were dilapidated, and there was a lot of drug activity and prostitution and stuff like that. And like I said before, all kidding aside, you can't have a bunch of white guys sitting in a black neighborhood doing surveillance. And the reverse is true. You can't have a bunch of black agents sitting in a white neighborhood doing surveillance because you're going to stand out. So we did the best we could. That's what we needed, the manpower. We were around the hotel, and luckily there was a Meridian Hill Park right next to the hotel. We had some cover there. But I'll tell you what, there's this young agent, name is John. He was on surveillance on 14th Street, and he saw something that would caught his eye. He observed a young lady walking out of a row house across the street from the hotel. And he looked at her and says, wow, this is odd. This lady was well-dressed, professional looking. So he watched her walk from her row house down to 14th Street, wait at a bus stop. The bus came. She jumped on the bus. The bus starts going into downtown D.C. So he said, you know what? I've got a hunch. He calls the team leader and says, hey, listen, I'm going to be away from my spot here. I'm following up on something. So he follows the bus until the lady gets off the bus. She got off the bus in front of a business office or a D.C. government building. So he parks his Buick car. He jumps out and he follows her into the building. And in the building, he said, excuse me, miss. She's like, what? Who are you? So he said, hey, my name is John. I'm with the FBI. Can I talk to you? And if you approach somebody and says, hey, I'm with the FBI, obviously it's going to cause people to get a little bit afraid or cautious. I said, I can't give you many details, but we're working on a very sensitive case in your neighborhood. And I saw where you left. I said, would it be possible for us to rent a portion of your apartment or home for investigative purposes? And she goes, what are you talking about?
I would look at that agent as if he had three heads.
Exactly, right.
Exactly.
And that's exactly what happened. And he goes, listen, here's my credentials. You can call the office if you want. He said, I can't give you more details, but it is a matter of life and death. And he says, hey, is there any possibility that we could use your place to establish like a little command post? And she goes, well, I don't know. Let me get my supervisor, which is a smart thing to do because you never know. It could be a con job. She takes him to the supervisor. He explains to him, hey, FBI, we're doing an investigation, life and death, blah, blah, blah. He said, we really would need a spot in the neighborhood that we can set up a command post without being on the street. And he goes, well, that sounds logical. He looked at his employee and said, hey, it's up to you. They're legit. I called the office. There is an agent by the name of John there. So he told the lady, say, hey, listen, it's really on you. She looked at John and she asked him, she said, is it really important? He said, yeah, really important. It really is life and death. So she said, okay. She said, what will it entail? He said, well, we would have a couple of guys come into your house. We would try to find a spot in a corner someplace so as not to disturb you. And we would just sit there and watch. She goes, okay, I don't have an issue. And he sweetened the deal by telling her, hey, listen, we can pay you rent for using your apartment. I think we ended up paying her like $300, if I recall. After that, John took her to the field office to introduce her to the surveillance, the SOG supervisor, and said, hey, what do we need to set up a lookout? He said, hey, we need cameras, we need radios, we need pens, pencils, we need extra batteries. They loaded up like a footlocker full of equipment. They put it in different bags. They got into a van. John went with them. The girl goes with the surveillance team. They park in front of her place. They get out like they're unloading suitcases and stuff. So she lets them in. The team looks for the best window to set up their equipment. I'll tell you what, Jerry, that was godsend. I mean, it was like, wow, fantastic. Because you know how it is. You get people sitting in a car for 12 hours a day. The neighbors are going to know, what the hell's going on here, man?
Especially if you've kidnapped somebody and you are looking out for law enforcement to try to find you.
Correct. The other issue, Jerry, was at the time, we didn't know where she was. She could have been in one of the row houses, or she could have been in the hotel. So we had to be very cautious. Anyway, this young lady saved the day. She was like, that was a touchdown. She let us in the house. I think we stayed there for 48 hours. John waited for her to finish up, and she left the apartment. He waited at the bottom of the hill, picked her up, and took her back to her office. The pressure on surveillance was relieved a great deal by having that lookout there. And it reaped benefits, because eventually the wiretap of the payphone was authorized, and then the lookout almost directly across the street from the payphone. And the Title III activated with a call to one of our other suspects in Miami. And then the photographs and the Title III confirmed that that was one of the kidnappers. And that was the leader of I call them the DC boys. He was a leader. He was a Hispanic. And the other three kidnappers were black kids out of DC. The Hispanic was talking Spanish to the other guys in Miami. So the link was finally connected, okay? Except we still didn't know where the woman was. Liz is down in Miami. She's doing the mobile home thing where the older man came up to say, hey, you can't park that mobile home here and you're stealing electricity.
From your book title, we know this whole thing lasted 7 days and it started on a Friday. By the time you realized that they had taken her to the DC Alexandria area, what day is it now?
We suspected on Sunday evening, Monday morning, okay, and it was confirmed on Tuesday. Miami notified WFO Tuesday afternoon. So we geared up the command post in Washington on Tuesday afternoon, and I stayed at the office all night. On Wednesday is when John saw the lady leaving her row house and go to work. The lookout was set up on Wednesday by noon or 1 o'clock in the afternoon. By that time, the ransom calls are still going in the Miami area to Ricardo's home. Hey, where's the money? Where's the money? Typical, your wife's life depends on this, that type of stuff. He kept saying, hey, listen, guys, it's not easy to get $1.5 million in cash out of a bank. He said, hey, I don't have that kind of money just laying around in a bank account. I mean, my money's working. Investments in real estate and all kinds of other stuff. And these guys didn't seem to understand that. So, well, you're rich, take out a loan. And the guy said, hey, a loan would take twice as long to get approved as it would for me to try to sell some of my holdings. Anyway, they kept going back and forth. On Wednesday, the Alexandria guy, Ramon, gets tired and he calls the husband and says, hey, listen, I'm going to be incommunicado for a while. I may not call you until later tonight or tomorrow. So he said, what's going on? He says, nothing's going on. I'm just letting you know that I might go dark, might go silent for a while. On Wednesday afternoon, Ramon flies back to Alexandria. By that time, we were all over him, surveillance and everything else. So we had a couple of agents accompany him on a flight back to Reagan National Airport. The Miami agents turned him over to the Alexandria agents, and then they followed him to his residence. They established his residence in Alexandria. At that point in time, everything just kind of stops. I mean, he's back home. Everybody's going to relax.
I do, just for listeners, you used the word turn him over. And I just want to make sure that they understand it was like a handoff. It was still done I can't even use the word.
Surreptitiously.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he had no idea that the Miami agents were following him. And now he has no idea that the Alexandria agents are following him.
It was what you would call a positive handoff. I said, hey, this is the guy right there standing there by the counter. He's wearing a white shirt, blue jeans, whatever. It's a positive handoff. At that point, the Alexandria office had him identified by visual confirmation, and they followed him. A woman picked him up at the airport. And funny, the car that the woman was driving had diplomatic tags on it, of all things. And we're going, oh my God, this is international.
Why did it have diplomatic tags on it?
Because the wife worked at the Organization of American States in Washington.
Wow.
She wasn't a kidnapper, but based on the Title III, she knew what was going on because she kept saying, hey, what about the money? When are you going to get the money? I'm scared. I want this to be over. When everybody was arrested, I'm getting ahead of myself, but this is post-arrest. The lady kept saying, I wasn't involved. I didn't have anything to do with it. But the Title III showed different. She kept saying, when are you going to get the money? I'm scared. We need to be careful. We need to leave town after this. It's like, yeah, she knew what was going on.
Just to clarify, that was Carmen, Ramon's wife.
Needless to say that the diplomatic tag was a shocker because the Organization of American States, for those listeners that don't know, it's kind of like a Latin American UN, United Nations, and it's strictly for Latin American countries, North America, Central America, South America, and they have diplomatic immunity in Washington. Everybody goes home, everybody relaxes, and we still don't know where the woman is. WFO is making headway. We tried to follow the Hispanic kid from the payphone when we saw him making a phone call. They tried to follow Raul from the payphone. He got lost. He went through some alleys. There's a bunch of buildings back there. We couldn't follow him too closely, but we were able to identify a building that he might be in. Again, the net was getting tighter and tighter on these guys, but they didn't know it. Wednesday afternoon, the mastermind, Alonso, was getting cold feet. He said, hey, this is taking too long. He told his number 2 guy, Ramon, hey, listen, this is taking too long. The guy's stalling. I don't like this. He just out of the blue said, hey, I'm out of the deal. The mastermind, the number 1 guy said, I'm out of the deal.
It doesn't work that way.
No.
In reality,
the number 2 guy, Ramon, goes, what the heck are you talking about? This is your plan. He said, whatever. He said, I'm out of the deal. Don't call me anymore. And Ramon is furious. Now he's left holding the bag. He's got the lady up in Washington somewhere. He suspects he's being followed because we've been following this guy for like 5 or 6 days. He's starting to see ghosts. Whether they're real or imagined is another story. So he gets upset. He calls the leader of the DC boys, Raul, and says, hey, I need to talk to you in person. He meets him at a record store in Washington. Said, hey, dude, Alonso is out of the deal. He chickened out. And of course, Raul says, what the hell is going on? When are we going to get paid? The boys are getting tired. We're the ones sticking our necks out. We got the package. We're tired. And the guy said, no, I understand you're tired. He gave him some spending money, like $100 or something. He said, you know what? I'm also considering getting out of the deal. This, of course, puts Raul over the edge. He goes, what the heck are you guys talking about? He said, hey, man, I'm out. The whole plot is deteriorating. We picked up on that on the Title III. Liz picked up on the call down in Miami.
Liz, what were you hearing on the wire about this deal kind of falling apart?
We did hear one of the kidnappers is getting upset and he's saying, hey, what do we do with her? And then he's like, well, if we don't get the money by Sunday or something, I'm going to shoot, is what he said in Spanish, yo tiro. We took it right then and there. It's like, hey, we've got to find her because they're getting to the point that they're possibly going to kill her if they don't get either the money or we pick them up in time. You could tell at that point, especially when the other guy calls Ricardo, say, hey, you deal with me now. And he's like, well, how do I know who you are? And all of a sudden, the comandante wasn't making the calls anymore. It was somebody else calling. And he's upset. And Ricardo at the time's like, man, what's going on here? Where's the other guy that I was talking to before, El Comandante? And he's like, well, you're going to deal with me now. And Ricardo started demanding more proof of life of her. At that point, we all surmised that, hey, if we don't conclude this successfully really soon, something's going to happen to her.
At this point in time, WFO, remember I told you that from the payphone, the first time we saw this Hispanic kid at the payphone, we followed him to the back of a building. Well, we sent in an agent in casual clothing. Again, it's a black neighborhood. A lot of black families work there. So we sent in this young kid dressed in a T-shirt and jeans. He took a bold move. We didn't know what else to do. So it was a 3 or 4 story apartment building. Each floor had 12 to 20 apartments on it. So he went from apartment to apartment to apartment. He would stand at the door, listen for sounds on the inside, TV, radio, or talking. And then he would knock on the door. And on the ground floor, it was pretty easy because he would ask people, do you know where the rental office is? And most people would say, get the hell out of here. What he was doing was he had the description of the Hispanic kid from when he made a phone call at the phone booth. And he had a description of his shirt and his pants. He was wearing a red shirt and like khaki pants. He went to every single apartment on the first floor, on the second floor, and when he got to the third floor, it took him like, I don't know, an hour and 90 minutes to run his little shtick.
What was he saying on the third floor? Because obviously he wasn't looking for the rental office there.
Good point. On the second and third floor, he just switched his story. He said, hey, I'm looking for a friend of mine. His name is Ricky. The idiot didn't tell me what apartment he was in. Do you know Ricky? I can't believe people would answer the door. But this guy was pretty good. People would open the door and say, I don't know, Ricky, get the hell out of here. So eventually he got to the third floor. And I think it was like the first apartment that he hit on the third floor, apartment 31. He knocks on the door. This kid opens the door and she's looking at him eye to eye. And it's the kid from the photographs that he's seen. Hispanic kid wearing a red polo shirt with khaki pants.
Raul, right?
Yep. He's trying not to be shocked, but he said, hey, man, I'm looking for my friend Ricky. He told me he lived here on the third floor. I don't know what apartment he's in. Do you know Ricky? Raul says, get the hell out of here, man. Don't bother me anymore. So he hit a couple of more apartments to make it sound legit. Then he runs out of the building and says, man, I got him. He's in apartment 31, unbeknownst to the kidnappers.
One of the things I have to say about this case review is that all of these different agents have made these on-the-spot decisions that have paid off time after time after time, or unless we are not hearing about the ones where they fail.
Well, no, you know what, Jerry, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, there are failures and then there are failures, okay? You and I have sat on surveillance for 4, 8, 10, 12 hours a day
Yep.
and not see anything. I mean, total nothing. If you notice my write-up that I sent to you, the last sentence on that write-up is, the FBI was at its best when things were at their worst. And I'll tell you what, this case proves it, man, because, I mean, the initiative that John took to hit that girl coming out of the row house, the initiative that this young kid, God, I forget his name now, he's just diddy-bopping around apartments. Hey, man, I'm looking for my friend Ricky. And he identifies the subject in an apartment. I mean, that was like incredible. We got so lucky. Luck has a lot to do with it, but it's also tenacity and professionalism and good training. But anyway, things are starting to tighten up. I forgot to mention, on Thursday, the Puerto Rican kid, the young Hispanic kid, Raul, calls Ramon back and says, hey, listen, man, I don't appreciate you guys leaving me, and I'm going to take your advice that you gave me at the record store. He said, hey, try to get something out of the deal, and I am going to try to get something out of the deal. But he said, understand this, if this thing isn't resolved by Sunday, I'm shooting. He said that a second time, okay? It's like, man, you talk about all hands on deck, 911, 911, what's your emergency? The FBI was like, hey, man, these guys are threatening.
And what's the day now? What day are we on now?
That was Thursday afternoon. At that point in time, the Miami office starts talking to the family and saying, hey, we have the phone booth in front of the Pitts Hotel. We have the building, and we were able to identify an apartment where we saw the Hispanic subject. The Hispanic subject was on the phone. We saw him in apartment 31. But we assume, we're about 95, 98% sure that Christina is in that apartment, but we have not seen her directly. It's not 100%, but it's in the high 90 percentile. We recommend a SWAT assault. Ricardo said, man, that's a big ask. I said, let me consult with my family. So he consults with his 2 daughters and son and his brother-in-law and brother. And he came back and said, okay, we concur with the SWAT assault.
I guess I am, and I'm not surprised that they told him that, because in a way it kind of feels like if it goes wrong, then he has to take some of that responsibility.
I think that's what the office wanted. They wanted him to know what their plans were, and they wanted to see how he felt about it. What do? You're kind of stuck there. You follow my thinking?
Yeah, absolutely.
But he concurred. And this is not necessarily public knowledge. I mean, not that it's classified or anything, but if you think back, HRT was a newly formed organization in 1983. HRT was assigned to my squad in the WFO at the time, or we were assigned to the HRT. I forget how it was set up. HRT wasn't necessarily a squad in Washington. We were more or less like, they were the tactical side. We were the counterterrorism and intelligence side. So we worked hand in glove at the time. HRT got the call. It was the very first time that they would be given an assignment, a real world assignment. This was Thursday. They were told to gear up because they were going to hit apartment 31 at 4 a.m. on Friday morning of July 15th. There's a lot of moving parts at this point in time. The Hispanic kid decides that he's going to call the husband, as Liz alluded to, and he had the wrong code word. He said, hey, you're not Comandante Jose. I don't know who you are. He said, how do I know you have my wife? And he goes, well, I have your wife. So he said, hey, I need proof of life. If I could talk to my wife, he said, I will personally fly to meet you anywhere you want, and I will hand you $500,000. He said, $500,000? He said, yeah, I've got the cash here in my house. So he said, let me think about it. So he leaves. It just shows you what greed can do, because at about 9:40 p.m. that evening, unbeknownst to anybody, they take the woman, Christina. It was the Hispanic kid and one of the black young kids. They walk her to the payphone at the Pitts Hotel.
You still have agents looking out from the row house across the street?
I was in the lookout that evening because I knew the HRT assault was going to be that night. As a case agent, I wanted to be close by. I happened to be at the lookout. It's like, what the heck is going on? There's a Hispanic kid, a black kid, and a white woman wearing like an evening gown. Not an evening gown, but she was very elegantly dressed, totally out of the neighborhood. And then he picks up the phone. The Title IIIs go on. Everybody starts going crazy. Miami starts going crazy. WFO starts going crazy. And the Puerto Rican kid told the woman, you can hear him on the Title III saying, hey, call your husband. I still have a copy of the recording in Spanish. She calls in for the operator. She says, I want to make a collect call to Ricardo. And she gives him the number. The call goes through it, and her daughter answered the phone. He goes, hello, Clarita. And she goes, oh, Mom, how are you? It was weird. It was almost like it was an everyday call. She said, Mom, how are you? She said, I'm fine. She said, here, let me get Dad.
Wow.
So she hands the phone over to Dad. That is the beginning of like an 8-minute phone call between his wife, the husband, And then the Hispanic kid gets on the phone. This whole time, the FBI surveillance team was just going absolutely crazy.
I want to know what happened next if they're going to grab her right there on the street.
Exactly. But the thing is, everybody was reluctant because they weren't 100% sure because she had her back to the lookout. All we could tell was that she was like a white woman. I mean, I couldn't tell whether she was Hispanic or anything. All I could tell was she was white. I could tell the Hispanic kid, because we had seen him before, was Hispanic. And then the black kid was kind of hanging around talking to the girls.
Let me get the scene straight. This is after 9 p.m. Is it dark outside?
It's 9:40 p.m. It's nighttime. As luck would have it, there's like a marquee in front of the hotel. The lights at night were shining directly into the eyes of the lookout. It was hard to tell who was at the phone, even with binoculars at night. But the Title III confirmed that it was the woman. We had radio contact. They started vectoring in agents from all around the neighborhood. The guys on the lookout, me, and his real name was Pembroke. We came out of the lookout. We started slowly kind of like acting casual, walking towards the hotel. And then finally, the guys with the radios, WFO, said, take them. That's when they moved in. There were several agents that moved in and arrested the subjects at the phone booth. I grabbed Christina and yanked her back. I said, hey, are you Christina? Yes. She was all terrified. We took her, threw her into an FBI car and drove her to WFO. Post-arrest, she told us she didn't know what the heck was going on because she knew that the gang was deteriorating. She thought that it was one part of the gang kidnapping her from the other part of the gang.
Yeah, because here you are, a Spanish speaker, coming up to her, and she's thinking like, oh, boy.
We told her, no, we're FBI, we're FBI. The agents arrested the two guys at the phone. Eventually, they rounded up all the DC boys. We took her back to the office, and the whole office was just ecstatic. We knew a lot of the case already, and everybody just felt so bad for her. We did some preliminary questioning. The office took some photos of her. But by that time, it was like 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. You know what a flower looks like when you leave it in the sun?
A little wilted.
She came off the adrenaline high, and she was just starting to wilt. 7 days of stress. Eventually, we said, hey, listen, we need to get her into a hotel. We assigned 2 female agents to escort her. She had a medical exam, and I honestly don't know where that would occur. They took her to a doctor just to make sure she was okay. They took her to a hotel and told her, say, hey, ma'am, just relax. You're safe. We're going to be sitting outside your hotel room guarding you. And she goes, oh, my God, thank you. By the way, before she left, I told her to call her husband. She called her husband. They talked for about 15, 20 minutes, and they were crying and stuff. And I told her before she hung up, tell your husband to fly to Washington. He needs to be here tomorrow. Unbeknownst to me, the Miami office had already decided that. And also bring a change of clothes. Because she'd been wearing the same dress for 7 days.
Oh, boy.
The rest of it is just like anticlimactic. We ended up arresting 8 suspects in Miami, Alexandria, and D.C. It's a happy ending, Jerry. I mean, it was really tremendous. They had their news conference at WFO on Friday morning at around 11. It was a happy day. We rescued this lady. Then the real work started, all the 302s and the evidence and the surveillance logs and everything else. Make a long story short, everybody pled guilty in the case except for the mastermind. The idiot, Alonso, he said, no, I wasn't involved. And I'm thinking, dude, you are so stupid. Everybody involved in the case rolled on him. They testified against him. Okay, and said, what do you mean you're not involved? Your co-conspirators are testifying against you. We had a 3-week trial in Miami. That case ended on July 15th. The trial was in November 10th or 15th in Miami. 3-week trial. Everybody testified against him. Plus the surveillances and the audio and the tapes and the this and the that. The judge didn't fool around. Normally, kidnapping is a 20-year count, and so is conspiracy to kidnap. That carries 20 years. The judge sentenced him to life in prison for his part in the case.
Tell us a little bit more about him, who he is, because it sounded like he was a business person.
Yes, he was. That's also in my book. The last part of my book, I go back and reconstruct how the plot developed. He was the son of one of the Castillo family's employees back in Colombia. I forget his name. The employee was a gentleman who worked for the Castillo family in Colombia. They knew each other. They weren't friends, but they knew each other. When Ricardo came to Washington to be the ambassador, the employee moved to Florida. And that employee, his son was Alonso Herrera. That's the connection. Alonso Herrera's father used to work for Ricardo Castillo's family.
We have talked for over an hour, and I know that we haven't even learned half of what is in your book. We've come to the conclusion of this case as far as this case review is concerned, but I certainly want to encourage everyone who wants to hear all of the behind the scenes stories and what you learned after the case concluded as you were preparing for trial. I want to encourage them to go out and get Hostage 7 Days in Captivity, your new book, which is available on Amazon or directly from you on your website, edmireles.com.
Yes. And you know what, Jerry? You're absolutely right. The book covers so many details that were learned post-arrest. If we took the information that we knew pre-arrest, it'd be like a 25-page book. But post-arrest, Liz and I were privy to the majority of the wiretap, the Title III recordings, the affidavits, our personal involvement, and then the court testimony, the interview of the suspects and the victims. I was able to piece the behind-the-scenes events that happened without our knowledge, because at trial, Christina testified for almost a day. She outlined the whole case, the way it happened and what happened and so on and so forth. She was terrified. She was petrified. She thought they were going to rape her and kill her. Imagine that, 7 days living like that. That would be terrible. It is a very complex, involved case. I'll tell you what, it was a very, very good case. Liz and I, particularly me as a chauvinist male, I was amazed at the poise and the strength and the grace Christina had. She was at the mercy of 4 strangers. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She wasn't stupid by antagonizing them.
Yeah, she hung in there.
She hung in there tough. And then Liz down in Miami, she was a fellow woman. You know, it's like she understood her potential issues if things got bad. She's a tough lady.
I tell you, the conclusion of the case, it was great after the trial and everything. That is the one and only case that I ever remember that the family actually invited all of us to their residence in Coral Gables for dinner. They had like a potluck thing, and it was just absolutely amazing, and how thankful that family was. I'll never forget it.
That's wonderful. And I have to bring up the fact that the poor HRT team did not do their tactical takedown, but I'm sure they thought that the way that it ended and you were able to get Christina to safety was still the best outcome for the investigation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I've no doubt HRT would have done a great job, but you know what, though? It's better to not involve doors breaking in and flashbangs going. So.
Do you have any photos or anything from the case that I can share on the show notes for this episode?
I can send you a copy of the photo for the Pitts Hotel. It's around the same time.
We will have some articles and some affidavits that people can click on and learn more about the true identity of those people involved from this public source information. They can go to jerrywilliams.com to see that. Plus, I'll have the image and links to where they can purchase your new book, Hostage 7 Days in Captivity. We've come to the end of the case review, but as you know, Ed, from having been on the show, I like to give everyone an opportunity to learn a little bit more about my guest. So I'm going to ask my standard question. We'll go through yours real quick, Ed, because they've heard you talk about this before, and then we'll talk to Liz about when and why you joined the FBI.
Well, thank you, Jerry. I'll try to keep it as short as possible. A young kid in South Texas. I'm the product of the 1950s, 60s era. I grew up watching the FBI story with Ephraim Zimbalist Jr., and I thought that was so fantastic, being an FBI agent. As I grew up, I wanted to be a police officer, and then I joined the Marine Corps. After my tour of duty with the Marine Corps, I went to the University of Maryland. After I graduated, I happened to meet an FBI agent who took an interest in me. He said, "Hey, listen, I think you'd be a great FBI agent. Have you ever considered?" I said, "Nope, never thought about it. I didn't think I would qualify." He said, "No, you're qualified." So he got me an application, and he said, "Use me as a reference." And I submitted it in 1978. It took about a year and a half to get in, but eventually I got in. I was one of those lucky individuals. Back in the day, the classes were like 25 to 30 applicants in a class, small classes. So I was so lucky. I was assigned to Washington Field, Miami, back to Washington Field, back to Miami, Quantico, Miami, Omaha, Tucson, back to Quantico. It's been a very rewarding career. Like I say in my book, the FBI is at its best when things are at their worst. We have so much talent, so much potential. We've gotten a few black eyes in the last few years, but nothing we can't overcome. Now I'll turn it over to Liz, the smart Mireles.
I was born and raised in San Juan, Puerto Rico. My mother was Hispanic and Puerto Rican, and my dad was from Boston, Massachusetts. And I, too, grew up watching Efren Zimbalist Jr. and thought it was the neatest thing to be able to just jump on a plane and go all over the United States and work all these different cases and everything. As a result, in high school, a number of my dear closest friends, their parents were FBI agents, their fathers at the time, no women agents at the time. After high school, I went off to college, and then I had a break for about a year and then ended up working as a clerk back in San Juan again. I quit after 2 years of doing that. I went to Oklahoma State University to finish my degree. From there, I went back to Atlanta. At that time, my dad had retired. He was with FAA, and he retired and went back to Atlanta. That was his home base. So I went to Atlanta and I joined the DeKalb County Police Department, where I worked there for 2 years with a crime scene unit. And during that time period, some of the guys were like, "Hey, Liz, man, you speak Spanish. You have a degree. Why don't you apply with the FBI?" Well, I hadn't said anything, but I had applied with the Bureau. The Bureau was slow at first, and then I went in and took some tests, and they said, "Hey, it'll be probably a couple of months before you hear from us. We will call you or let you know what the next step will be." Not a week later, they called me back and said, "Hey, the process you through as quickly as possible." At the time, they were having that Mariel boat lift from Cuba and stuff, and they really needed native Spanish speakers. So I was fortunate to get caught up in that. I went to my lieutenant at the police department. He's like, "Alton, don't tell me you're going to quit. I can see it in your face." I was like, "Yes, sir." And I gave my 2 weeks notice, went with the Bureau, and I joined the Bureau in May of 1980, went through the academy, was sent back to the Atlanta office, where I ended up getting involved with the Wayne Williams missing and murdered children case as one of the 2 crime scene agents assigned to the case. After that was over, about a year and a half later, I got transferred to Miami. That's when I got involved in that long-term undercover case with Ed, and the rest is history. I followed him, unfortunately, back to the academy for 2 years after he got shot down there in Miami. That was really a tough time for us. Being at the academy was interesting, but it's not what we really wanted to be in the FBI, was instructors. So we had the opportunity to go back to Miami. We chose to go back to Miami, back to the field, and both of us got involved in other major cases that were really great. We ended up back here at Quantico, Virginia for our retirement, and here we are now in Virginia.
All right. Other than writing great books, what are you both doing now?
Right now, just the books, mostly, and a little bit of law enforcement or consulting. I worked for 17 years on a contract with the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, along with 6 other agents. So we had kind of a mini squad after I retired. It was pretty good because the DIA had it all set up where they would have the applicants come to the main building, and we had our little offices there, and we just did all the interviews and paperwork and stuff, and that was it. So we didn't have to even make the appointments. They were made for us.
Yeah, sounds like a sweet gig.
Oh, it was. It was wonderful. Ed's been the primary doing consulting and teaching about the FBI Miami shootout and the lessons learned.
I'm also a use of force expert witness in police cases. I'll defend police officers, but I won't testify against police officers. That's hit and miss. I mean, it just depends on the region and the case and so on and so forth. That's been interesting as heck, as people have a misconception of what police officers have a right to do. I mean, obviously, these cases end up in court. It's interesting as heck.
We ended up doing mostly security clearance briefings and interviews for the background investigations.
One last plug of both books. First, the FBI Miami Firefight, 5 Minutes That Changed the Bureau. And then the newest one, Hostage, 7 Days in Captivity. So I like to give my guest the last word. Liz, why don't you go first? And then Ed, you can give us your words of wisdom.
Well, we really appreciate having done this interview with you. Appreciate all that you do. I'm sure you enlighten a lot of law enforcement officers as to different things that happened in their lives and might happen, and hopefully they'll take heed and Godspeed.
Ed?
I second that, Jerry. And thank you for the opportunity to speak with you again and to your audience out there. It's been our great pleasure to be FBI agents to serve the country. I've had a discussion recently. It's like, hey, who do you want to send to deal with that gang down the street? Your mother, my mother, or do you want to send a trained professional? Obviously, you want that trained professional to deal with problems. And as always, I just want to close by saying, hey, people like Liz and me and many, many, many hundreds and thousands of other men and women across the country, they all stand between the citizens of this country and danger. Sometimes people forget that. They face danger every day. We have been so lucky in serving, we've managed to make it to the end.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com, where you'll find photos of retired agents Liz and Ed Mireles, open source documents and the true names of the individuals involved in the 1983 kidnapping conspiracy case, as well as related images. There's also a link to Ed's previous two-part FBI retired case file review episodes, 118 and 119, about the April 11th, 1986 Miami shootout. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist, where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.